Welcome back to the Mining Mum podcast. I'm Tegan, your host, and today I have a very exciting guest, Becky. A disclaimer before we start today's episode, Becky will be discussing some sensitive topics around sexual assault, harassment, and also mental health. So I just want to make sure that as you listen, you take the time, and if you or someone you know needs help, please call Lifeline or 1-800-RESPECT. She is my first guest of 2025 on the podcast, and I am so excited for you guys to hear her story. She is a wellness specialist, predominantly in the mining industry, empowering women in a male-dominated industry. She has also just launched or co-authored a book with 24 other exciting and inspiring women, which we are going to be talking about. Thank you. And another exciting thing, she has just been nominated for Women in Resources. So thank you so much for joining me today, Becky.
A pleasure. And it's nice to be back recording as well for the year. It's exciting. When you asked me and it happened so fast, I was like, yeah, let's get this done. I love it.
Let's get into it. January. Yes, I love it.
Yeah.
And also you have your own podcast as well, we forgot to mention. So
I do.
We'll get into that a little bit.
There's lots to cover. I'm sure we'll be here for 3 hours.
No, exactly. We should have actually had some wine.
Yeah. I don't drink, but
I'm not drinking
or
either.
coffee. I would have been like,
yeah, exactly. I need another coffee.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the recent nomination for Women in Resources. So what are you nominated for, and how did it feel getting that nomination?
Really exciting. Definitely being nominated for any awards, because obviously no matter what you're doing, within the industry, outside the industry, as an advocate and activist, and being somebody who's speaking up and speaking out, you're not doing it for the awards. Mm-hmm. So it's always an honour to be a part of something like that. But especially for CME as well, I think along the journey I've been not working alongside CME so much, but when I first put my high vis on, there was nobody down at Parliament when the FIFO inquiry into sexual harassment against women was, being put through, and there was a lot of people speaking in the way of corporate and companies, but there was nobody really speaking or feeling confident enough to be a crew member, somebody who's had experiences to be there and speak. So I remember going down to Parliament House, which is where we're so close to that now, where it all began, with my high vis on and being like, do you need somebody to speak from the space of somebody who's had the experience? And so CME were there, and I remember working with them, the crew. It's obviously changed a lot now, but it means a lot more because it's with them, because I feel like they've been a part of my journey. I don't know if they feel like I've been a part of their journey, because they have done, they do a lot, but they were probably at the forefront of making a lot of things happen. So I feel really honoured for my first, I've had other awards, but as a finalist in this, I feel really honoured that it's that one. So it's supporting women in resources. I think I've said it right.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's exciting. So that's on the 13th of February. And it's been really cool to be a part of. They are super professional, and it's going to be a really big, awesome night, and we've got a table there. So, yeah, like I said, it's nice to be nominated. It's nice to be a finalist, and it's especially nice for it to coincide with a company that's been, I think, quite pivotal in making a few changes.
That's so good. And it's an amazing acknowledgement to the work that you have been doing. So, Becky, I mentioned before I came to one of your talks up in Port Hedland when you came up with Soa, who is also a mental health advocate. And I got to hear your story firsthand about, some of the sexual assault that you suffered as a teenager, and then workplace, assault as well, and harassment. So, obviously being an advocate and putting yourself out there and talking about your personal journey and experiences, how did this all come about?
It's really interesting because it seems so counterintuitive to share the shitty things that have happened to you in life. But I would say I'm intuitively led. I'm in that space where it just felt right at the time to be able to share, and where it's led to now. It started from doing the podcast, quite honestly. So my story is I've been in mining for the last 7 years, and during my time in mining had majority exceptional experiences and good experiences with all the crew, the people that I worked with. But I had a few shitty experiences where, so first 2 weeks I started there, went to the bar putting up posters, and I was called over to a table of about 10 guys. And one of the guys said to me, hey, what would you do if I bent you over the table? And I was like, shocked. And I kind of walked away because nobody said anything or did anything. And I walked away, and you know how you have that little voice in your head, like, go back and say something, show him who's boss. And I was, shitting myself because I was only 2 weeks into mining. But I turned back and I said, I'll watch you on a flight home because that's where you'll be going if you speak to me again. And so I was like chuffed with myself, went and spoke to a colleague and said, oh, my God, this dude just said this to me. And she was like, it's just the way it is. That's mining. Like, kind of get over it.
Yeah.
And so it was so conflicting to what I'd been taught in life, in the world, that you don't put up with things like that. But that was my first 2 weeks into it. I was, new into the industry. There were so many things happening in life, and I didn't end up reporting it or sharing it with anybody else. It ended up stopping there. And like I said, had some great experiences in between, got along with all of my crew as you do, like having come from it. But the shitty thing about these stories and the stories that I've heard from other people and the podcast and also being a lived experience is it opens up to other people to share. And while I had good experiences, about a year and a half into it, I again was at the bar putting up posters because that was my job to be there. And I didn't actually go to the bar very much at all. I stopped drinking 5.5 years ago. And I was in the bar again. It was Valentine's Day, and I said to one of the guys, like, are you okay? I didn't know him that well. And I was like, are you okay? And he was like, oh. And I was like, do you want a hug? So I gave him a hug. And I felt something like wet on the back of my neck. And I was like, what was that? And a guy said next to him, oh, he sniffed your hair. And he said, I licked your neck. And I was like, what? What? But I laugh about it now because you have to.
Yeah.
But actually it's cringe. And whenever I share it, it's cringe. And the thing that I've learnt and been sharing so much is everybody cringes, whether you're a man, a woman, or whoever cringes, because most people wouldn't do that. And I didn't share it with, anyone straight away. I kept going on about my business because I could see a camera was up there. I could see that people had seen it, so surely something was going to come about. But it didn't. And I shared it with a colleague, and he said, you've got to report that. That is not acceptable. And I was like, and I'd gotten into this habit of kind of not speaking up for myself and, based on things that had happened as a teenager in my 20s, 30s and all of that kind of stuff. And it was through his support and the brotherhood and the family that you get up on site. It was through their, family that supported me to make sure that I went and spoke to somebody and supported me through that. It ended up getting dealt with, and that person was, they had to go through some disciplinary stuff where they had to go through appropriate behaviours. And this was like 3.5 years ago, or 4 years ago, where that wasn't happening on site. And they went through that. But then I came back to site after going on my R&R, so it was probably a swing and a half, so I was back about 3.5 weeks later. You don't get told what's happening, which is another flaw in what happens. You don't get told what's happening with the person that's done it. You don't get told if they've been disciplined, whether they've lost their job, whether anything's happened. It just is dealt with HR. You have to just know that it's happening. And for the most part, up until that point, it was the discretion of the supervisor or the manager to deal with it or not. And for the most part, people weren't. They were just like, get over it. Do you know what I mean? And so anyway, I came back to site and I was put up in the top camp, which was like pretty gross. But you're in mining. I'm grateful for a bed. I'm grateful for my food. I'm grateful for a job that's bringing me in money. It's up the top. And my bathroom window, I found out, was facing his front door. And so the people who'd placed me in the room, my bosses, had put me up at top camp without thinking about it, that he was in his there were thousands of rooms on that camp, and something put me there. And so I complained and I said, the person that it's happened with, I didn't know what was happening, but he can see into my bathroom window.
Yeah.
And they were like, we just don't have any rooms. They didn't move me. And it was then that there was a fire in my belly where I was like, this isn't fucking good enough. This isn't good enough. And I said to my boss, there's so many of these things happening. I found out there was a peeping Tom on site. I found out once you open up the door, you realise all the not so good things that are happening. I think ignorance was bliss previous to that. Whereas after I had my experiences and I shared, I realised there were a fair few things happening. And I said to my boss, we need to do something about it. And he, in essence, said, it's not our responsibility. And that pissed me off.
Yeah.
I was like, I've been brought up, we used to go to protests as kids, Mum would take us to rallies with trees. So we've always been taught to be outspoken, and it was over life, that I'd kind of stopped speaking up for myself. And this was a really, the light was shone on the fact that I had stopped speaking up for myself, and I wasn't alone in that. So many people don't speak up. One, because it's uncomfortable. Two, because you end up being the one who is the problem.
Yeah.
There's a blacklist of people who do speak up, if you do speak up, and it could mean your job, unfortunately. Now things have changed, and which brings us to the work that we do now, but then it wasn't happening. And so I then pivoted, left FIFO. I was really burnt out and really stressed out from just working in it and all of those things that had kind of happened and nothing coming from it. And I started the podcast, the Resource Podcast, having, hard conversations, making hard conversations easier around workplace culture, harassment, sexual harassment, and speaking with survivors of sexual assault and, speaking about those things that people are afraid to speak about. And I believe, and I know now the world has changed, that all of us believe that the things that we avoid are the ones that we need to speak about most. And so that was the concept of the podcast, and it really opened my eyes to the not so great things that were happening in the world. And so that's a whole journey in itself. And even anyone with a podcast, anybody who's outspoken as an advocate and activist, you kind of go down not a rabbit hole, you go down a little bit into seeing the shitty things that happen in the world. And so it was a real journey to get myself into being hopeful and actually seeing that there's so many things that are happening, there's so many conversations that are happening, people who want to make an impact that weren't happening back then. And I do believe that the workplace has changed. There's still a ways to go, but it's changed.
Yeah, I definitely have seen over the 10 years that I was working in mining a massive change from when I started to now. It's more talked about. It's obviously they've put, a lot of companies have put things in place to help support, people. So yeah, I can definitely agree.
It's a whole new world, and we wouldn't be up. And I love having these conversations because where I feel lucky, you brought up SOA before. In the conversation, I think back then, I felt really alone in the conversation. I felt really exposed, and speaking about it in the media, speaking about it on the podcast, I did have an experience of trying to work with a company around respectful behaviours and kind of being ostracised and a little bit bullied about my business, which was really interesting because that was the whole concept of it, and experiencing, if a company that you're trying to work with has issues within it, I think people feel threatened when you're trying to come in and help, because a lot of the time when it comes to culture in those companies that don't have a good culture or haven't had a focus on good culture, it's really dog eat dog, or it's really chuck people under the bus, people are trying to steal my job, bullying left, right and centre, and people don't have that security in themselves, in their role. So I felt that when I went in. And so I've grown and changed from those experiences. I don't take things personally anymore when we go up and speak with SOA. People don't necessarily want to have these conversations, and you'll be in a room full of potentially 100 male-dominated industry where they're looking at you like, here we go, we just want to get to work. We don't want to have this conversation. But some do. Out of that room of 100, some rooms you go into and 50 people want to have that conversation. Some rooms you go into, only 5 people are interested in that conversation. And then other companies you go into, 95 people will be. And so you have to remember, I think, with these conversations and sharing as a lived experience speaker, speaking about mental health, sexual harassment, sexual assault, and, like child abuse and things that happen for people and trauma, is that it's not going to be comfortable for everybody, but one person it takes to impact that one person, and it causes a ripple effect.
Yeah.
And it's never just one.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of, anything anonymously, obviously?
Yeah, totally. So many.
Yeah, I guess, from the impact of your work.
Yeah. So I do consider myself really lucky to go up with Soa. He's, you've met him. He's a big energy. He's a 6 foot something Tongan.
Yeah.
And what I value is that we get to learn from each other. He's been, an ex-UFC fighter. He's done so many things. He's a man living in the world. I'm a female living in the world. So we have some great conversations around what that's like and giving insight into what that's like. And I appreciate that when I go up into these companies, he shows me respect. I show him respect. He shows people how to treat me as a speaker, and it's really interesting when I'm there with him, and when I'm there without him is completely different. But I value that there are advocates, men and women, predominantly men, who are being the active bystanders and doing something, and they're also, a lot of the time people can be gatekeepers in creating that good culture, but men who are willing to kind of stand up and say, he doesn't have to be like, hey, you treat her well. It's this is how we do it. And so I value that. And so you asked the question of, experiences we've had. I think it's important to share that is the baseline when I go up with him. And he shares around his story of, mental health and experiencing, attempt at suicide and experiencing things as a child and abuse and stuff like that. So it really opens up the room, and I share around being a survivor of teenage sexual assault, around having my parents who struggle with mental illness. So mum struggles with psychosis, and dad has struggled with manic depression, bipolar. And just sharing openly and authentically, sometimes for people, a lot of the time, people are blown away and they go, oh my God, why would you tell people that? Because the tough thing is everyone, we ask a question like, who has not been through a challenge? Everybody's been through a challenge. And we look at people, and if you've done a good job in sharing your experience authentically without coming from a place of ego, without needing people to like you, without needing to do a good job as a presenter, but instead share who you are and the things that have happened in life and how you might have helped yourself or had other people help you to get better, it opens people up for things that have happened in their life. And so I shared one time up on site my experience as a teenager, and I go into a little bit of depth but not too much, because you have to be really mindful not to be, it's trauma informed, and you want to make sure that people are safe in those environments. I shared my experience as a teenager and what had happened to me, and that I didn't tell anybody for 20 years, and that I thought it was my own fault, and that I felt disgusted and horrible about myself. And I had a fellow in the room who was really resistant to it. He's just so resistant, and we'll get heckled some of the time, not all the time, but some of the time. And he, at the end of this presentation, and I'd been there for 3 days, at the end of the 3 days, I needed a lift back, because you can't get anywhere unless you need a lift. So you're reliant on other people. And in the car, we were talking, and he said, I was like, hey, tell me a bit about yourself. And we were just having a conversation. I didn't need him to tell me anything. I was just, there. And that's the thing, is people are ready when they're ready. But he said, we've got stuff going on with family. And I was like, oh, yeah, do you want to share any more and stuff like that? And so he was telling me that he had conflict with his family, hadn't spoken to his mum and all this kind of stuff. And he just kind of came out and said, you know how you shared about what happened to you? I don't know if that's true or not. Like, what happened to you? Like, I wouldn't be sharing things if that happened. So he's questioning whether what had happened and what I'd shared. He kind of said, I think it's all scripted. I think it's all like a load of shit. And from the work that I'd done in not taking things personally, I was able to not take that personally and not need him to believe me, but just be more intrigued and inquisitive as to what made him get to that kind of point. And also not trying to assess everyone too. That's a big thing.
Yeah.
And like, he may very well just have that opinion and that's totally okay. But what ended up coming out is that he had an experience as a child. He had been, unfortunately, molested and abused as a child. And he said, I would never tell anybody, and I've never told anybody, and it feels so, weird that you tell anybody. And it was really interesting because we went into it. I asked him if he wanted to share, and he was talking about how when it happened, he had told people and nobody believed him. And I was able to say, after taking a breath, isn't it interesting that you don't believe me? And like, at that point, we both kind of sat with it, and I was like, oh, it makes me a bit teary, but I was like, I believe you that happened, and you don't have to share with anybody ever again. You've shared with me, and I hope you feel lighter from that. But he'd shared and he'd never told anybody in his entire life. And to bring it back to the stuff that happens, that's not everybody's experience, but that's what we're dealing with having these conversations, is that people are walking around carrying burdens, things that have happened to them, things that they've done to other people that they don't feel like they deserve forgiveness for. And then they have to pop on a smile, pop on a uniform and go to work and pretend like everything's okay. And so that's the reality of these kind of conversations. And it is, a real blessing in that being the experience that we have. And then on the other end of the scale, we have people come up and share with us things that have happened that they've never shared with anybody before, and say, thank you so much for sharing your experience, because I've never told anybody and now I can go and get help. Or I've had an experience around losing somebody to suicide and I'm up to here, I'm about to, the kettle's about to boil and go and get some help. And because I'm a female in the industry, I'll have women come up to me and say, these are the experiences that I'm having. I don't know how to deal with it. What can I do? And feel safe in knowing that I'm an external source that I can point them in the right direction and get them help. But then also we have people who are speaking up and people who come up and say, hey, because of the experience that we had with you and you sharing the stuff that you did, this happened and I had this conversation and, I was able to help this person, or I've now started seeing somebody professionally. So rewarding going up and having these kind of conversations. I feel really honoured to have them with SOA because it's, having the male and female kind of dynamic and both of us sharing. And then in the mining industry because has such a perception around it. And I had that perception too. I was told by, some of my family like, oh, watch out, don't go to the bar, and it's, they're cashed up bogans and they're gross and they're this and they're that. Yeah. And the interesting thing about these conversations and what I've been, what has kind of come to me most over the last year and a half is that the shitty behaviour of the 1% or 2% is tarnishing the whole industry, and it's disappointing. But also, we've always said, I remember saying it down at Parliament House that time, that the resource sector can see it as an opportunity to create change, and other people will follow because it's happening not just in mining, it's happening all over the place. Yeah, it's society, and so I commend and enjoy watching the industry be at the forefront of creating and paving the way, because WA and Perth in general is a FIFO state and a FIFO town or city, and it's a ripple effect for everybody that companies are taking the initiative to do that. Some are doing good, some aren't doing good. Some people are doing a terrible job and you're like, what? But then for the most part, there's people who are trying to make those impact. And so that is what I love being a part of. And now making sure that I'm looking after myself and I have my own habits, and you got to practice what you preach.
Yeah, talk us through them. What's your kind of wellness tips and what you follow in your daily routines?
All of the things, like everything, all the things that you do. The biggest thing was definitely acknowledging where I needed to do work on not taking things personally. It's actually happiness coach Jules who has said the quote, if you don't heal the things that hurt you, you'll bleed on the things that didn't cut you. He said that, and it really resonates with me that I was really, because of, being a survivor as a teenager and having a lot of really shitty experience happen in my 20s and my 30s, I was really bleeding on people that didn't cut me. I had a perception of men. I had a perception of the industry. I had a perception of women who didn't speak up. I was really judgmental and really righteous in this conversation. That we've got to do something and everybody has to say something all the time, and going down the path of where it's really taxing constantly speaking up and constantly using your voice. And so having compassion and empathy when people just need to, they're making an impact in different ways. And that using your voice looks different to different people. You know what I mean? You don't necessarily have to be an activist or an advocate or get a podcast, or making those little changes, which aren't little. They're a ripple effect of speaking up, or speaking up for yourself, or educating your kids around things, or, having hard conversations with people. So because it became that taxing, the things that I do, I meditate every morning.
Oh, good.
And every night.
Yes.
And when I was up on site, actually in FIFO, when I was coming up against resistance, I'd meditate, like I'd have to just take a breath 3 times a day and just be like, personal, as I go.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah.
I just interviewed a guy he's similar, was in FIFO, and now he's a meditation coach. And so he's got me on a program. So I've started trying to meditate every day. It's literally so hard because I'm just like a bang, bang, bang person. But I have been doing good every night, trying to take that time.
Trying is like the first step, 100%. Also, I'm not a parent, you know what I mean? Like nobody stops me from doing anything, or like it's not dependent on other people. So as a parent, I find it can be a little bit harder.
I feel like I need it more.
100%, because sometimes you're like, I love you.
I need to just have
my shoulder. Yeah. But they don't go like, when you're up in FIFO, when you come home, they don't go, hey, Mum, you know what? Just take some time, just chill out. Do you want me to make you a cup of tea? They're like, I need you. I love you. I want your attention. Yeah, feed me. Like we need to do all of this kind of stuff. So, taking that time and getting into routines. I would like kids eventually. I haven't been not successful, but I've had an ectopic pregnancy and a few other things that haven't worked out. One day I would like to be kids, but one day I'd like to have kids. But for now, I don't have them. So all of my friends are like, take the opportunity while you can to travel, to have time, to go to the bathroom by yourself, all that kind of stuff.
Yes. I miss those days.
Yeah, sorry to rub it in, but have a shower by myself. And so, meditation, I do breath work as well, even though I've got like this love-hate relationship with breath work where I'm like, I just want to lay there and have somebody speak into my ear, but I know how good I feel and how rewarding what you put in, you get out of breath work. So if you really go all in, 9-day breath work is really good as well. And I speak to somebody, professional. Before it used to be because I had to work through stuff that had happened in life or things that were happening then. Life was chaotic all the time. Yeah. It was like life was a reflection of all the decisions I'd made in the lead up to it. So it was a shit fight. Yeah. And being able to help other people, it wasn't falling into place because I wasn't helping myself and I just abandoned myself, all the time. So going and speaking to professionals like a psychologist or a counsellor, and then now to go up on site, to have these conversations, to give them my best to people and to people who need that help, to have these conversations, I make sure that it's a prevention and preemptive kind of conversation. I go to a counsellor and a subconscious conditioning coach to help me with my, the stories that I've grown up with and how my perception of myself. And you're always learning about yourself. So that I stopped drinking 5.5 years ago.
Yeah, I was going to say, so was it like personal choice to?
It was, yeah. It was at the time. My body told me I had to because I got pancreatitis actually, because a part that I share when I was younger. I think it seems like I've painted the picture that my life was like terrible and horrible. I've had a great life. There's been shit that's happened in life like everybody else, in my upbringing and things like that. But for the most part, I always had a good time doing a lot of stuff. I was just really chaotic, and I would drink, and with drinking came drugs and everything else that came with that. And so the tough thing about drinking and drugs is I did have a good time.
Yeah.
And so it was hard to stop. I had a good time with the people that I was there with. I'd go to music festivals, I'd travel and I'd meet different people. But I was that person where when I drank, I couldn't stop, where I'd be like, let's go out all night and let's go to another party. And I was hanging around with people who were always the same as well. But I got pancreatitis and I still kept drinking. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. I just look back and cringe. I'm like, Becky, come on, honestly. But my body was giving me the signs, and I went travelling over to the UK and met up with some friends over there, and I hadn't drunk for the whole 6 months really. And on the last night, somebody was topping up my drink, and it was the last time I drank, and I hadn't drunk for such a long time before. And the next morning I was so hungover, it was like death. Yeah. And I had a 32-hour flight back to this side of the world. Oh, my God. And I was like, I'm never going to drink again. Oh. And that was the last time.
You kept the promise to yourself, which is amazing.
Yeah, and it helped with going up to FIFO, not drinking, because it meant I wasn't at the bar making decisions that I didn't want to make because they inhibit, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You do shit that you don't want to do.
Yeah. No, I've just made the choice as well for, I don't have like I'm never drinking again, but I want to kind of have a no alcohol couple of months.
Okay. I'll hold you like accountable, but I was
supporting, mental health, starting a new business. It's like similar to advocating, like when you're putting yourself out there, when you're, starting a podcast or being on social media or starting a business, it's really, not isolating, but it is confronting, and you go through those thoughts of, what are you doing? And so I think like with me, I was drinking to aid my confidence. Yeah. And then it was kind of getting into a bit of a bad spiral. So I'm like, no, this is the time to have a refreshing year and see how it goes. So
how exciting.
Yeah, very exciting.
There's more, I think there's more drinks that you can have now, and it's more accepted kind of thing. Yeah. And a choice that you get to make. I thought I had anxiety and depression, but it turns out I was like just in this
coming up, coming down, hangovers. I reckon.
Yeah, literally. And you do just use it as advice instead of dealing with the stuff. Yeah. Whereas if you deal with the stuff that comes up and that's what makes you go to drinking, it's eventually, there's always stuff that comes up. But for me, being on that journey of not having drinks, the people that I was surrounded by were different. The choices that I made, life took a whole different turn, because I wasn't using it as advice. Yeah. And it's not for everyone. Some people need it, and that's okay. No judgment. Although I must say when I first started, I was like,
when you quit smoking, everyone's like, oh, that smells so bad.
Yeah. So I've gotten off the righteous train now and been like, okay, whatever journey you're on, it's totally fine as well. Oh, so awesome. But how exciting. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks.
Yay.
Cool. And let's talk about the book. So you just launched it with 24 other women that co-authored it. Talk us through it.
So it's essentially, and I've always kind of wanted to write a book and then always felt like who am I to write a book? And I think that's when we speak about it, I think that's a consistent theme for a lot of women, that they're not, who wants to hear my story? Who wants to hear what I have to say? And then I thought it was just women, but turns out as well, everybody has that kind of thing where nobody wants to hear my story. I need to get on with it and get over it. And the feelings of not being enough, not doing enough is a human thing. Yeah. It just depends on what that is about your your story that kind of speaks to that, I suppose. But for the book, I was like, what am I going to write in here? I want to write a whole book. What am I going to put in a chapter? And I saw it as a really good opportunity. One, I love MG, who's a businesswoman in Perth, who she's collaborative, she's generous, she's abundant in her, that opportunities aren't like, oh, I can't share them with people because I don't want to not have money. I love being around people who the opportunities are endless. There's enough people to work with. You don't have to take all the opportunities. So I loved being in collaborative with 24 other women. And what was really cool is some of our stories intertwined and then others really were completely different. And what I love about it, if you are going to read that book, no matter who you are, going to relate to something in that. And so that's what I love about it. But my chapter is around, I called it Stay Quiet, Nobody Likes a Loudmouth, because growing up, always talkative and just being like, oh, shut up, like, can you be quiet? And it was my own narrative where I was like, I was sick of hearing my own voice and always speaking up, because you go through that wanting to be accepted and not always being outspoken, and just sometimes it's exhausting. You're like, God, I wish I could just be quiet sometimes. But then noticing where I'd lost my voice and what the journey was. And it was like what we've spoken about, having that experience when I was younger, which is not unique. You know, a lot of people have had that experience, not exactly the same as mine, but something similar, and not sharing it. So the biggest thing for me was that I didn't share it. I didn't tell anybody because I thought it was my own fault. And then that dictated the things that happened in my 20s, my 30s. And the part of the book that I speak about is going through having the ectopic pregnancy and being in hospital. And I sat in the waiting room in a 10 out of 10 pain, waiting to be called up. And I was just like, God, you can die from ectopic pregnancy.
Yeah.
And when we finally went up and the nurse, when I spoke to the nurse, she said, what's your pain out of 10? And I was like, it's a 10.
Oh, my gosh.
And she was like, oh, okay. I was like, oh, yep, I'm pregnant. And she was like, category 2 over da-da-da. And she's like, why did you wait? And I was like, oh, just be polite.
Yeah.
And it was just so, I look back and think, it obviously was meant to happen. I'm here now, and there's plenty of other things that have happened to other people, but it was a real pivotal point for me to where I go, shit, I didn't speak up for myself, and it nearly cost me my life. And so it made me reflect on all the times I hadn't spoken up for myself, and where the journey of me finding my voice and speaking in the media and speaking about my experiences. I know that I get messages all the time. Thank you for sharing this, because it made me realise that I need to share, or I need to do something about it. And I had this real fear when I first started the podcast and speaking in the media that somebody was going to, hunt me down and not like what I've got to say, and they were going to hurt my family. And because at that time people weren't speaking about it. So it was overcoming that. I'm safe in sharing. I've got support when I share, and when I use my voice, it's okay to do that. And so that's what my chapter is about, with some ins and outs. What we've spoken about today, encouraging other people to use their voice, whether that is, with advocacy or speaking up for yourself at any points, with your boundaries, with your family, with your friends, with workplaces. And so, that's what the journey is about. And then the stories of the other women, it amazes me, some of the things that people have been through, and that they're like literally still standing with a smile on their face, that they still love, that they still love people. You do. That's for you. I brought that for you. It's mind-blowing what people have experienced. And so, I feel really honoured to be a part of that book as well.
I love it. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, I can't wait for you to read it as well.
You'll be my next.
Please.
Yeah.
The irony is as well is I don't read books.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah, so I'm like an audio. I'm an Audible girl through and through. I really struggled with school. Where paying undiagnosed ADD, 100%. It makes me like vivacious and fun and like creative, but trying to concentrate on like squirrel, So the irony is I don't read the book, but I've read that book.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, so if that's you, hopefully we'll do it in audio one time.
Yeah.
But, that's why I started the podcast as well, and why I started doing, other things, because there's a platform that people who can't necessarily concentrate.
Yeah.
Having information around workplace culture and, unconscious bias and mental health, so people don't have to always read a book about it or do the research themselves.
I love that so much. Amazing. And before we wrap up today, I always ask my guests, what is your one piece of advice that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Oh, okay. So something about me is when you ask that question, I've got millions.
Yeah. Ding, 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 ding.
Yep. All of the advice. Something that comes to mind, and doing the podcast and stuff as well, something that I went to the bathroom to do it. I always say to myself, I trust myself. Mm-hmm. I trust the right words will come and the right people will hear them. And that is important for anything that I do in life, important for what a lot of other people do in life as well, is that you feel like that's your only opportunity to say something or do something, but you'll be given that opportunity again, and trusting yourself at any moment that you're making the right decision. Any decision is the right decision because it'll take you down a path, and you'll make some other decisions along the way, and that the right people will be impacted by the action that you're taking at that time, whether it seems big or whether it seems small. So that is what comes to mind. And also, advice. Support network is really important as well.
I love it.
Wherever you're at in the journey, whether you're somebody who's listening and, you work in mining or you work at any other role, make sure you've got your support network. You can show up as your best self when you've got people around you. And if they're not supporting you, then they're not your people.
Yeah.
And really, for being in this space, my friends and family have stood by me, in the most uncomfortable times. And, having my own back, and loving on people and not being afraid. I don't have to be this macho female to survive in mining or in male-dominated industries. I get to be in my feminine. I get to be, it's safe to be myself. Yeah. And that I don't have to pretend to be anybody else, that being myself is okay. And that changes all the time.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I love that you've done this, and I love that you've taken the step to be able to do it, and that you're giving people a voice. And I love being surrounded by people who are taking action and doing things and like making those impact to people. So thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can find Becky in our show notes. I'll link everything in there of how to get in touch. So thank you so much.